Recording. Good evening, everybody. We are now meeting with Leeza Ahmady. Tell me something. Is that how you pronounce your name? Did I come close?
Yeah, it's fine.
How do you like it?
It's Ahmady. It's
Okay.
kind of a very soft and gentle way of pronouncing the H. So it's Ahmady. Yeah, but
Ahmady. Got it. All right. Where were you raised?
I'm sorry.
Where were you raised?
I was born in Kabul in Afghanistan, and I was living there until I was about 11 years old. And then we left when the Russians invaded Afghanistan and the war began to be getting worse. And my mom decided to get us out and meet with the rest of my family, with most of them who were already in Europe and in the States. But we had to spend a couple of years en route in Pakistan, where I learned Indian Bollywood dance and Urdu language, and yeah, wasted a lot of time, I would say.
Okay.
We got to the U.S. I was about 14 when I got here.
Were you already precocious when you were 14? You must have been.
I don't know what that word means.
Mature ahead of your time.
Okay. I would say so. I think that something about the experience of exile and listening to adults constantly speak about politics around you definitely, matures you.
Did you go to school in New York, high school in New York City, or were you outside of New York City, or what?
Yeah, I landed in one of the most popular most populated immigrated city in the world, Queens and Flushing.
Yep.
So I was exposed to a real massive culture shock at that age, having to interact with people from all over the world. So it wasn't just the exposure to the American culture, but the Queens, New York culture, which was constructed of a massive number of immigrants from all over. Meeting people from South America, for example, was incredible because the way that I look, also a lot of people thought that I was from Colombia or some part of South America and expected me to speak Spanish. And so it was a very interesting landing. And so I went to school here, and I went to...
What grade did you start in? Sophomore in high school?
I started ninth grade.
Ninth grade, okay. And that was in English?
Everything was in English, and I had to learn English from scratch. I knew hello and goodbye and some other sexy words, but that was it.
And how many languages do you speak now?
About 4 or 5.
And were you discriminated against in high school? Were you discriminated against because you were an immigrant?
No, because as I described,
everybody was.
Everybody was an immigrant or from somewhere else. But what was interesting was the encounter of the, this cosmopolitan multiplicity of cultures and
right.
having to learn how to create space for yourself and for your otherness in the middle of all the others was quite intriguing and probably traumatic as well. I would say it wasn't about discrimination, but a sense of having to explain yourself quite a lot and being someone who in a sense always end up being a representative of a country, of a region. And I was just a young person, but that liked heavy metal.
Right, okay.
And I could fit in almost in any I guess that the experience of leaving home in a way prepared me, and that the 2 years living in Pakistan, which was also not a culture of my own, very different, was already, it had prepared me to sort of, adapt. But I think within the adaptation process, there happens some fragmentation within your psyche, where you have to be multiple people in a way, multiple personalities within yourself. And I have a twin sister, so that was even more interesting. We were identical, and we got a lot of attention.
I bet. Are you really different? Did you acclimate differently, or are you really similar?
We are a lot alike. We have a lot in common. She chose a different path. She is a Chinese doctor. She's an acupuncturist and herbalist.
Awesome. Now, all right. So where did you go to college?
I went to St. John's University, one of the largest Catholic universities in America, and I was studying pre-law, philosophy, politics, anything that had to do with rebellion and understanding something deeper.
Okay.
But ultimately, I had said that I was going to law school to shut my family up about what I was going to do, because
Did you do that?
I'm sorry?
Did you do that?
I think one of the expectations, I mean, I think it's a universal...
Of course, no, but did you go to law school?
Oh, no, I didn't. I ended up not going to law school, thank God.
Okay.
I chose to go to study a semester abroad, the transformation of the communist system into the market system.
Where did you do that?
In Budapest.
Okay, beautiful.
In 1993, 94, right when the whole transformation was taking place there. In fact, I was traveling to, I think I was going between Poland or Venice, and suddenly, like on the train, I heard that the Czech and Slovakia separated, and I had to I couldn't go through Czech Republic to get back to Hungary, and I had to find another way to get there. So it was a very tumultuous and interesting time, but this is where I met two art history professors who were teaching just Western civilization art, and I signed up because I was interested, and suddenly just going to Europe and looking at all the, the Uffizi, and I fell in love with Renaissance art. Let's put it that way, simply.
So all right. So how do you meld rebellion and Renaissance art? I don't think. Well, Caravaggio was kind of rebellious.
The humanist. Come on, what do you think?
Okay.
The humanist philosophy is what.
Well, we have that.
Fueled,
Renaissance. Then we get up to the Napoleonic Wars. I don't know. All right. Anyway, that's fascinating. Keep going.
So I was in front of I was in front of a Giotto painting in front of, in the Uffizi, when I realized that I definitely do not want to go to law school, and that if there was something about the how energy, I felt like there was something captivated within the painting that felt so alive and present, and I could only describe it as energy, that it really made me think that maybe I want to be involved with something alive, rather than shuffling paper in courtrooms. And part of my interest in law was because I was interested in policy making and making a difference in the world by creating awareness. And I just always, I fell in love with aesthetics, because I've always been into aesthetics, and my background, my family, there were poets and writers, and art and philosophy was a very sort of common part of my life and my upbringing. So it just made all sense. It clicked.
So what did you do? Did you go back to school and you shifted to course entirely?
Yeah, when I came back to New York, I spent my last year taking art history courses and graduated with a minor in art history. And you know, by the time I was supporting myself like anybody else in New York, working in the city as a waitress. And about a year later, I decided that I wanted to curate.
Okay.
I learned what curating was, in a sense, and I just had an intuition about it. And I just like the fact that it means interacting with artists and contemporary artists, so artists who are working now. And it just happened that I was hanging out with other friends who were also on the creative path, and we were all into clubs. We were dancing all the time. We were young. It was the 90s. We were rebellious towards, it was the New York Giuliani years, right?
Yep.
So I ended up getting creating a proposal and getting a budget from New York's, one of he's considered like a, king of the clubs, who was, finally deported at some point. But Peter Gation, he was notorious for creating budgets for art events, because he knew that it would justify the presence of his clubs within the community boards in Manhattan. And so a number of my friends and myself proposed an entire art program. I took over the art, the exhibitions, and another friend was doing fashion shows, and another one was doing film screenings. So the idea was to bring, the reason why we could justify the budget was because we promised that we were going to bring the right crowd, older, interested, culturally, mature adults.
Right. And it worked?
Absolutely. That's how I started my career.
Wow, that's fabulous.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I also think that in the art world, it's not all that uncommon. I mean, there's a mixture of intent and luck, and and making things happen, being in the right place. I mean, you had an epiphany in front of a Giotto painting. I mean, these things are marvelous.
Yeah, I think it's a combination. It was at that age, I was very driven, and it wasn't very much about, it wasn't that conscious. It was a drive of having to succeed and prove myself, and sort of show the world what's possible, which was fabulous. I mean, I always had some kind of a mission, even in the club scene. I didn't want to just do art in art that was made for the club. No, I actually went after serious art and thought about why not clubs acting as a public space,
Sure.
because already there's so many people going to it. And in fact, people who normally wouldn't go to a museum end up going to clubs. So it's even more interesting because I'm tapping into a whole new audience that could either, become interested or might not, but at least it's something that it just, from the very beginning, it was interesting to think about the audience for me. And I think at some point, it was also an opportunity to interact with gallery directors, museum directors, and artists who normally didn't have the opportunity to make large-scale experimental site-specific works that would take a long time, a lot of money in a museum or in a gallery because it would be they're market-oriented, they have to sell. So it gave me the opportunity to sort of reach out and not just stay safe within the space of like the so-called club scene, club art, and just really come from the outside in
I think those are really solid instincts. You know, in this course, we talk a lot about growing your own community and taking responsibility for your career and creating your market and finding the people who identify with your mission or your vision, you know, the kinds of things precisely like you did, you know, and then you took it further in terms of having it, you know, fit with your mission and the synergy, the relationships with working with the artists. How many projects are you working on now?
Well, multiple projects, but I mean, ultimately, what happened in that I realized it was fine to do what I did, but at some point it was very broad. I was working with all kinds of artists, all types, and for those first 2-3 years of my career, it was great to work that broadly because it allowed me to just have no limitations and not to identify with anything and just really understand what curatorial work is, which to me became simply about mastering the art of communication with a lot of different types of people, besides being able to read artworks and communicate the significance of artworks to a public, to write about it, to contextualize it. But at some point, it became very exhausting, that scene, and also limiting. And I had to ask myself, what is really important to me? You know, what do I want to focus on, and what do I want to do that will be fulfilling, and not just coming from like a defensive space of like, here I am and I'm doing this and I can do it. And that question took me to take some time off, and I looked into art history. I did some more art history, and I went to Hunter, and I almost went to do my master's in art history at Hunter, but I realized that, you know, I'm not interested in art history per se, but I'm much more practical and want to create opportunities for artists and curators and just have it be much more dynamic. So I ended up finding a program that was right for me. And this time I also decided that it was going to have to be, if I'm going to invest another 30 grand or so on my education, I wanted to make sure that it allows me to do something that creates a kind of a specificity for me that people would that would be valuable to people. And so the question was very like there's something that I was really thinking about all the time, was what was going on in Central Asia, what was going on where I'm from, because contemporaneity has, it's something that just exploded onto the art scene in the last 40 years. And the reason why it has happened is because the world started becoming much more connected, and suddenly we're finding out about, all these artists working across South America. We're in Brazil and Argentina, and we're looking at artists in Eastern Europe, and we're looking at artists in South Asia and Central Asia, which is a series of countries that are all ending with the N. So I'm talking about Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan. These countries were part of the so-called Second World under the Soviet rule, who all had become independent. And I knew that they absolutely had some kind of an art system that they were operating under. And so, but there was just no information. And I chose that to study what was the development of contemporary art in Central Asia as my thesis for my master's program. And I used every course that I had to develop one aspect or another of a question that answered something about what was going on in the region. I applied for grants, traveled there. Because there was nothing written, and because there was very little available also in English, because much of the research that was available was in Russian, a language that's I didn't learn because I didn't stay in that sphere of the world.
Yep.
So I had it was a lot of work, and it took a good 4 or 5 years of absolute focused engagement and activity to create visibility for the artists and art practitioners that I met and discovered in that region. And
it served you really well. How much did you know where you were going when you were doing it? I mean,
no, it was the same.
Because now you have a lot of clarity. When you were doing it, did you know that this is where you wanted to go, where you are now, or is this just how the road ended, or where the road took you?
No, when I was doing it, I knew that it was very important to me that the artists from this part of the world should also be visible in biennials and in international programs. And I became much more engaged with international exhibitions and events. And so it was, my desire was that I wanted to create a voice for that. Yes, so it was quite clear from the very beginning, but I didn't know that the road, that there was some kind of a, it was a journey that I went on. Yeah.
Got it. Wow. All right. So how many projects are you working on now? I want to know more about what you're doing in the present.
Okay. So, well, what I am working on is, so essentially the story came to, bring me to this other insight, which is if I want to do something about anything, an area that's specific, Central Asia and the artists there, I also need to understand what Asia is, because it is part of a whole. And my entire upbringing and the way that I think still is very Eastern. It's a very holistic approach. And so the question for me is, if I want to understand Central Asia, then I must also understand or create relationships and expose the fragmentations of this part of the world also with Asia itself. Yep. And so that brought me to become the director of a program, which is a biennial, a very large-scale event that happens here in New York, either annually or biannually, depending on the kind of budget that I managed to raise. It's a consortium of museums, about 35 museums and galleries in New York, all major from, it started very small, very specific Asia-based, Asia-oriented institutions like Asia Society, China Institute, Japan Society, and whatnot. And when I came on board, I was very determined that I wanted to continue to broaden it instead of having it be a conversation about just Asia, to bring in larger institutions who are beginning to look at artists in China and in Japan, but also in India, and they were also looking at smaller places like Lebanon, and so it's been a whole. It's a program that really allows me. So it's basically producing public programs, a lot of conversations with artists, curatorial discussions, but also exhibitions. And it allows me to be engaged with, all the, shakers and makers of anyone who's really dealing with any part of Asia. And the relevancy of it is that, it's just constantly growing. This place called Asia is constantly changing and growing. And, we're talking about a continent that's, I think over 3 billion people or more, so it's extensive, and so much of its history is really not yet explored in universities, in museums, in the United States. And I think all this creates gaps in what happens with policy and economics and public relations. And so I think that still my work is to create awareness in one way or another about these parts of the world and issues that are taking place, not because of me, but because artists are no longer just staying in their studios making work in isolation, and they're not only concerned with materials, but their materials have become issues, environmental issues, scientific discoveries, innovation, archiving, hidden, hermetic events in the world that people don't have access to. So it's a very interesting time to be an artist and to be a curator, because what has happened is that it's not very definable what art is anymore, and that might be sometimes very frustrating for people, but I think I find it extraordinarily empowering. So I do that.
Let me ask a question. I'm curious. Do you find that your role as a curator is different than the historical role of a curator?
I don't know what you mean by historical. I think that historically curators were behind the scene.
Yes.
And making exhibitions in these kind of stale environments called the museum.
Yes.
And today they're a lot more active and much more in the forefront of facilitating relationships between institutions and within institutions, because whether you're independent or you're working with an institution, a curator is essentially has a bank of knowledge, or is constantly trying to create a bank of knowledge. And for me, it's not only creating knowledge for myself, but then allowing and creating possibilities for others to tap into that knowledge is very, very important.
How much does your point of view show up in the exhibitions?
I have decided that I was very attached to exhibition making for a long time, like many curators are. But in the last 4 or 5 years, I am realizing that it's very easy to get attached to or understand success in certain limited ways, and exhibition making is one of those. I mean, it's kind of like the final product, and I realize that actually I'm interested in the journey and the process. Mm-hmm. And often when you're making an exhibition with artists and you're working through the entire process of getting the work, deciding what work you want, why does it work within the theme or the concepts that you're trying to explore with the artists. All of that is in a way hidden, and you're trying constantly to find a way to bring that out, either spatially or within the text, or any kind of information sort of that accompany the show. But it's often not that possible. And
here's the issue for me, and I support what you are doing. I believe in your mission. There are curators who I think present points of view in their art and find artists to fulfill that point of view where the artist's artwork doesn't necessarily, or the artist wouldn't necessarily want to be in that school of thought, grouped with those other artists. They would be flattered to be included in the exhibit, but they don't necessarily think that their art has anything to do with white horses or whatever, okay? So that it's like the curator becomes into a position where I think they're seeking to serve themselves and not serving the artists. And I think that you are interested in serving the artists, but I'm wondering how you feel about the issue that I'm raising.
I agree with you completely. I'm from the school of thought that whenever I hear the word, "What's the theme of your show?" I get really annoyed.
Okay.
Because I don't start anything from myself. I might have intuitions, but the starting point for me is always the work of the artist. What are they doing? Why are they doing it? How are they doing it? And what is the significance of what they're doing? And so if I am invited to curate an exhibition, or if I'm invited to speak in a panel discussion, or any kind of program that is, in a sense, all curatorial, I allow myself to be guided by what I find are the common denominators of what the artists that I'm interested in, I've been looking at around me, are doing. And so it's really there many times, you know, I end up having to talk about the work, you know, after it has happened, after the exhibitions, much more successfully than during, because I do want to refrain from, you know, but while, you know, at the same time, you know, you can give some references and contextualize the work, but it's a tough thing to carry on, which is why I have become more and more interested in programs whereby the artists themselves get to find a way to speak about their work in their own words, in their own formats. So I'm doing a lot more interviews with artists. I'm trying to do much more virtual, and I've become very interested in a studio visit as a kind of an incubator of creativity that's, you know, unparalleled. And because when I'm visiting with an artist in their studio, something magical happens between me and the artist looking at their work. And that magic has to do with not only the work itself and the artist speaking about the work and sharing, but my insights as I'm looking at the work when I'm sharing it with them. So that exchange between myself and the artist, or an art practitioner, to me is an exhibition in its own right. And it's just a way of changing your mentality and, you know, what it means, what exhibition means, and what.
Yeah, you just froze. I hope you can hear. I think that's fabulous. You're wonderful. I don't know a lot of curators that think like you do. I can think of maybe one or two. Can you think of many other, I mean, do you feel alone with other curators, or do you find that there's enough people that think similarly?
I think that there are, I find that in the art world, it's really, really difficult sometimes, because many times we get boggled by intellectual jargon.
Yep.
And it took a long time for me to find my voice and to stop referencing others and really, you know, have confidence in my own intuition and my understanding and experiences. And so I think one of the things that I don't do is theorize. I'm not interested in theories. Theories are very useful, and they're wonderful. They allow you to, you know, maybe be a lot more critical and think. But if you're constantly in the world of theory, then you're not in a world of reality. But there are, I would say that there are plenty of like-minded individuals from other parts of the world, around the world, that are beginning to create new schools of curatorial thinking and doing. And so I don't feel necessarily alone, but it is, there are times that I just, you know, want to like shut my ears to all the heady stuff, you know.
Good for you. Do you know Dan Cameron?
I do. He's actually someone I think that's very much driven intuitively.
You and me both. Yeah, Dan's one of the. Yeah, Dan and you are in. You know, the boat just got bigger. That's nice. And you know, we did a webinar with Dan. I don't know, a year or two ago. And you guys should listen to the discussion with Dan Cameron. It's almost as good as this one with Leeza. Let's open this up for questions. Cynthia, you have a question. Go ahead.
I do. I want to know, I just kind of wrote this down, but do you think, because one of the words that I wrote down that I felt that applies to you from what you just said, and then I wrote down a note that when you use the term fractured, having a fractured life, because you went through a lot of tumultuous things early on in your life, do you believe that an individuated voice, which to me is what you're saying that you have, comes from the realization of being fractured and sort of having a journey to become an authentic voice? Like, how do you think all of those experiences that you had led you to where you are now? Because obviously what Paul is saying, I feel as well, it's a really different viewpoint from a curator.
Well, thank you. I think you said it. I think that, you know, I wouldn't necessarily sort of put myself on a trophy, as if, you know, my experience is very special from another individual. I think that all of us have unique stories, and I think that having to live in a sense, constantly having to maybe prove myself or present another kind of image that's different from what the imagery that you constantly see about Afghanistan or this region of many regions of the world. I've had to kind of also allow myself to separate from that, you know, and just be myself and be who I am, because at the end of the day, I'm just a citizen of the world, and you know, there are so many stories like mine, and there are stories that are even, you know, someone just growing up in Alabama, having just this hardcore life, you know, early life, and so I guess without the down, there's no up, and without the up, there's sometimes not down, and you know, so yeah.
Well, I just want to say this one thing. One of the things that I feel like kind of intuitively maybe is that you keep going. I don't know how to express this, but it's like you keep going to the truth. You keep going to that seed. You keep going down to that real thing that's in there and shutting out all the other voices. And that is really special. And
oh, that's really, really, thank you so much.
Really?
Wow, I'm so touched by that comment. Thank you. I think I do that. I think I definitely try to do that. And in the art world, I have to say, it's very challenging, because it's a very seductive, full of you know, imagery, and images are, you know, they're very powerful. They can create a lot of like illusion and wants and desires in us. And I'm always having to say, okay, why do I want that? Like, that doesn't sound like me, you know, it sounds like someone else. And I think it's something that I have to constantly remind myself as a practitioner, that if I want something that looks or sounds something on someone else, what kind of price am I going to be willing to pay? And I just, you know, I'm very interested. The reason why I do this work is because I love people. It's not just the work, art. You know, art is very interesting. That's fantastic. But I could just go and you know, make money in another field, probably a lot more money. One of my constant, you know, struggles is having to like support the kind of activities that I engage in, because it's not always, you know, it's not valued in the way that it should be. And so I'm always asking also this question: how can we be responsible as creative individuals, as artists, as curators, to change this dynamic that we've created in whereby we accept to be paid a lot less than, you know, than we should be, and, you know, take responsibility for that. And it's not easy, because when you want to do something, that drive, you know, it's like there are times that I have to catch myself and say, wait a minute, you know, how is this gonna, like, how am I going to also be fulfilled by this in all ways, financially, spiritually, and a lot of times I have to accept that I have to also change my mentality about it, and think about, okay, what's this? What is the value of this? You know, if there's like another kind of currency, maybe.
Well, I think this is my last comment, but I think that a lot of times this happens to artists as well, meaning there are times when I'm painting and I don't really like what's coming up. I paint from the unconscious, and it's like sometimes I'm like, well, and I'm thinking, well, it's coming up, and so let it come up, you know, meaning like you can't judge it. And it's the other thing was that what I heard was that the same things that you were doing in government, when governments were basically doing things to you that you didn't want them to do, you had to move because of them, you had to judge them, you had to like go to the truth because obviously you were being uprooted because of them. It's really similar to what you're doing in art. And that's all I have to say. I've been talking too much. It's really nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia. Becky, your turn. Go ahead, Becky.
Hi, hello. Hello, Leeza. Thank you for sharing your time with us. I have two questions, very different. And the first is, I don't have a lot of knowledge in this area, but can you describe sort of the difference between contemporary art in the Central Asia artists and contemporary art in the US? Is there a difference? Are they in different places or times, or looking different or looking the same, or?
Right. So that's one question.
That's one question.
Okay. Well, that's a very interesting question, and it's asked quite a lot. Art is quite similar everywhere in the world. I think that there are different timelines. When I was in the early 2004, 2005, and 2006, when I was traveling around all over Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan, I was absolutely blown away by painting and sculpture. That the skills were. You know, this is a region of the world that had an actually established art system, whereby artists were sent to the best schools and are in the Soviet Union, and they went to they all had, when they graduated, if they did well, they all had their own studios. They got paid to make art, and after they made work, they were kind of guaranteed to show their work, exhibit their work. So you're talking about 50, 60 years of this kind of a system, which then collapsed, and suddenly the umbilical cord was broken, and artists had to like figure out what to do on their own. And those who were already very active on the ground, they were already looking at not conforming and making work that was just socialist, realist sort of propaganda art, and similar to what was going on in China. Those artists who were already very active, and they were, prepared conceptually to sort of like just snap out of that kind of a system, managed to really do well. And then there are lots of artists who are who just end up doing kind of like, let's say, Orientalist work, Eastern Orientalist work, very modernist works that sell to tourists. And there's no judgment to either. They have to survive. But I had to, like, I would walk into a studio and have to go through Monets and Manets and Picassos and Modiglianis or whatever, in order to like then suddenly get into the real series, which was the artist's work. And they'd be like, oh, that's just for me. And I'm like, well, that's what I'm interested in. But the artists that I work with that are showing internationally, their work is really not that different from artists in the US. But I guess the question is, what kind of contemporary artists are we talking about? Are we talking about that their choice of medium is a lot more in installation and video, because it just lends itself easily, and there's so much more historical connections, theater and performance art and street theater. There's a lot of historical connections too. So I would say that good art around the world is very similar, just as what kind are we talking about, what time period, and what were some of the influences and conversations.
Thank you. No, I've been to Prague and I've been to Budapest, and I've seen the art that had existed under communism.
Right.
And then the art that was coming out, and it didn't compare with the art that I was seeing in the museums in the US, but yet I've seen art online that looks like it's very comparable and very creative and on the edge of things. And I just didn't know if the timeline had caught up to the rest of the world in art. And I forgot about that that championing that Russia did, where they actually paid people to follow a career. I forgot about that.
Well, people also forget that Russia is where half of modernism also propelled, right? I mean, constructivists and other, avant-garde, Russian avant-garde art is part of the heritage of the artists. Their work too, but also Sufism and Islamic art practices were so all of these heritages and disciplines come to play in the contemporary artist's work, and that's what's so interesting, that we're learning about so many missing parts of history through the contemporary artists' works now, because they're the ones that are sort of digging up the information, and the work of older artists are coming up because younger artists are looking at the works.
So that's sort of my second question, which is, you're talking about lands that have been ravaged by war and there's been a lot destroyed. How do they know what their art history and their culture is, other than what they remember seeing it? Does the art still exist?
If you would have gone to Documenta in Kassel, Germany, which is I'm not sure how many of you are familiar, but it's one of the largest exhibitions that happen every 5 years in Germany. And Caroline Christoph Bukairov, who's a curator, I would say has a lot more intuition than many, many more, but she's also definitely very intellectual simultaneously. She fell in love with, she was in love with Alberto Boetti's work. I don't know if you know this Italian artist who made a lot of work with embroideries in the 1970s made by Afghan women. And this Mexican artist was looking into why would this Italian artist in Afghanistan would go to Afghanistan in the 1970s and make work. And so out of that, Caroline was like, let's go to Afghanistan and find out. And then they found out that he had opened up a hotel in the 1970s and would go and make work there every year until the Russian invasion. And so out of that story, suddenly Caroline was organizing for the first time another Documenta site in Kabul, Afghanistan, whereby 45 artists from around the world went to Afghanistan to make art, and including 35 artists from Afghanistan who participated both in Kassel and in Germany. So all of these things are sort of constantly happening, but so this one of the things that she exhibited, for example, was a really funny looking sort of like Picasso-esque painting that actually was a way that this one artist had saved a canvas, a very old canvas, of a Buddhist image from ancient Afghanistan that was in the collection of the museum. So art has different ways of surviving and continuing, and war actually doesn't necessarily while it destroys its possibilities, on the other hand, many places in the world where there actually is a lot more struggle is where some of like the most interesting practices are occurring because of the limitations and the urgency and the need to connect with the history and the need to connect with creativity. It's there.
Thank you. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, Kathy, your turn. Go ahead, Kathy.
Lisa, how are you?
I'm okay. I'm
Good.
feeling
Well,
thank you.
I was very intrigued by something that you said earlier on, that
I can't
art is no longer definable as any particular thing. I think that's how you said it. It's no longer definable what art is. I think that's what you said. Yeah. And I was just curious about that and intrigued by that. If you could kind of explain further what you meant.
Can you repeat that? What did I say?
Yeah, that it's no longer definable what art is.
Oh.
And I wanted to know if you would comment on that, or you could explain further.
I think what I'm trying to say is, okay, if you, sometime soon, hopefully I'll have the documentation of this amazing program that I just finished organizing as part of Asian Contemporary Art Week here in New York. 35 artists and art practitioners were brought, I invited from different parts of the world who happen to somehow be focusing on Asia, or they're from Asia and their work relates to it somehow, but very broadly. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing was that, like, for example, if you go to Kabul right now, right? It's, you know, you can go into neighborhoods and suddenly you will walk into an area where you see, like, you know, 10 or 15 or 20 different storefronts where there are portrait painters, you know, and they'll make your portrait, they make your family portrait, and, you know, that's art to them. And there is no question to that person that that's art. You know, so in a way, it's a very subjective topic, and as curators, my colleagues and I were becoming much more sensitive to defining what art is from a perspective of education here in the West or perspective of education somewhere else, because you know, art is the act of creating. It's the act of thinking while doing and making something, and so. Who's to say, like, what's really, you know, what makes it so? And it's interesting because another friend of mine who's an amazing curator who moved from Australia to China, and then from China she now works in Vietnam, and she said that, you know, she had this very minimalistic kind of like super conceptual work. Beautiful. She was so proud of it in her this gallery, which is white box gallery in the middle of I don't know what's the name of Vietnam's capital. Anyone?
Ho Chi Minh City.
Yes. And you know, this man came in and was like staring at it for a while, and then asked her, "Where is the soul of this work?" And she was like flabbergasted. She's like, yes, I had to ask myself, where is the soul of this work? And so in that sense, you know, when I look at an artist who is going to, you know, for example, Mariam Ghani from Afghanistan, she is this brilliant, she's really great in making videos and performance and digital work. And when she had the opportunity to make work in Afghanistan, she decided to digitize about 100 years of Afghan films, because they were getting lost, they were getting destroyed, and who knew that there was 100 years of Afghan films? Wow. and so she went with a team of like 4 or 5 people from India and other places, and they spent a month training this institute called the Afghan Film Institute that has been existing since 1970s to digitize their work. And that is her artwork. And that became a kind of a material where she used many of the materials that she found in different ways in her work. And so there are people who would say that's not art, right? Well, how is that artwork? And so it has become quite extensive how we view and relate to and speak and think about art. It really depends on who's talking about it and how are they going to maybe contextualize it and give it power.
Right, right. Well, it's great to hear you say that as a curator. It's hopeful from my point of view. So I just had one other question. Are there any particular websites or any particular books or articles that you might refer us to that have to do with, you mentioned new way of thinking about curating, like you're one of many people who are thinking differently about curating. Are there any reference sites or anything that you can think of that we might look at?
Well, you can, there's a lot of material in my own site, AhmadyArts.
Okay. What is your website?
It's AhmadyArts.com.
There was a link in the email that I sent out when I sent out the invitation.
Okay. All right. Okay.
And some of the programs and artists that I've worked on, right, who are very, very active right now throughout the world. You can also look at acaw.info. So acaw.info. That's the Asian Contemporary Art Week's website, and it's got a lot of information. Independent Curators International is I would say that it's very interesting because they work with all kinds of curators. I had a program with them, and they're very open to thought across the sort of arena, and so they have this program called Dispatch, where there's a lot of different curators who've gone to do different research in other parts of the world, making work. I would say one thing I would say, if you are based in the US, one of the things that is happening that's so interesting is that artists are really doing a lot of residencies. They're moving around a lot, and it's really, really doing wonders for their support, for their practice. I actually consider art making as a practice and not as something that ever ends. And so I would say that if there would be anything that could be most beneficial to you beyond just really focusing on your own practice is the ability to go to other places to make work and to test out your ideas and to interact with other kinds of communities. And there are so many now residency programs. They're challenging. They require application process, and some of them cost money and all of that. But I would say that really look into taking advantage and going to other places and other and trying on moving your studio for a while somewhere else, because there's some kind of a magic that happens in an activity, and you tap into this whole new community of people that might be interested in your work that you might not find in your immediate surrounding. That happens a lot with international artists. They just end up, like most of the artists that I work with really have like 4 or 5 different places that they're working out of. They're kind of like these modern nomads, really.
Yeah. That's true. That's great.
Thank you.
We're running out of time, and I don't know what to do because I've got 2 or 3 more people who I know have good questions. So let's make them brief, and let's answer June's question and then Sam's, and then we'll be done. Kathy, you already went, so I'm not going to call you again. I'm sorry.
Right.
June, go ahead.
That's fine. I didn't want to be.
Okay. Leeza, thank you. I'm enjoying this so much. Thank you so much for sharing this time with us. I have 2 questions. I'll try to make it quick. In 2002, 2003, I'm an art educator, so I'm sort of changing this a little bit. You worked with the YMCA in almost 100 schools to create specifically cultural, diverse arts education programs for youth. Will you tell us more about the creation and implementation of it? And then I would like to hear about your experience at the Venice Biennale. I happened to be there that year, so it'd be awesome to hear about the program that you did there.
In 60 seconds or less.
Okay, so very quickly, the YMCA was the only job I've ever had whereby I was working for, full time for an institution. And it was really great. The other day I told my husband that sometimes I fantasize about working for Trader Joe's because I just love how, you're just standing there and you're ringing things up and you're really into that whole thing and you're not thinking. Because sometimes being in the art world and the curatorial role, this constant machinery of thinking is exhausting. It takes a lot of energy. And then I realized, knowing me, I'll probably start a Trader Joe's art program or whatever. You are who you are wherever you are. It's very interesting. Mm-hmm. So that's the answer to that. The fact, creating this art program for the YMCA out of nothing. The Venice Biennial was amazing. Are you talking about 2005 or
2001?
2001 was great because it was definitely not, it was before September 11th, before anyone had any clue about Afghanistan, really. I loved it because before I would say I'm from Afghanistan and people would be like, is that in South America? Because I look like I'm, Colombian or something. And so it was a great time to go, and we kind of invaded the Venice Biennial and with this artist Roya Riazi and created this a nomadic pavilion, Afghan pavilion. so it was
you mentioned on your website, you mentioned in your CV that no other Afghan artists had been represented at the Biennale before you did that. So I thought that was remarkable. Like I said, I was there and happened upon the Africa and Jamaica, which was interesting, just the locations of these places and the inclusion of other places at that time in 2001.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's just about really breaking the box and doing something that you would surprise yourself, and others. So it was just one of those acts. It was a very natural thing to do at that time for me. Yeah.
Thank you, June. You're rather spunky and mischievous. There's an element of fun. You're dealing with really heady, serious issues, but there's an element of fun that runs through absolutely everything that you're involved in. That's really nice.
Thank you.
All right, Sam, you get the last question. Have you unmuted yourself yet? I have. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for joining us. I have two of my favorite artists, Shazia Sikandar and Huma Baba. Do you know them?
Yes, I do. I've worked with both of them.
Yeah, okay. So now I'm curious if their work, they're from Pakistan, right? So
yeah. Back
home in Pakistan, is their work considered, I don't know how the word, I don't know whether it's not standard, but is it unique back there? Because it certainly has an amazing kind of an exotic and darkness to us over here in the West. And so I'm just sort of curious back there at home, what's their perception of local?
Well, I always say this, that, the interesting thing about the art world is, that we're always, there's this, I talk about this concept of the periphery and the center, and that the fact is that the periphery always gets to be somehow the center, and the center turns into the periphery, because
wow, yeah,
in the Sufi world, in the Sufi concept of the world, the world, the universe is, running in circles that move in and out, concave and cave. So it's if you think about it that way, the art world itself is really a periphery of this massive world. And so again, who are we talking about? If we're talking about like the art communities in Pakistan, absolutely, they're very well known, and they actually, well, at least Shazia was a student in Lahore, and that's where she learned all her skills of miniature painting and all that, and then she came to the US and is now an outstanding artist of America. And Homa Baba, I don't know her work. She's I think she's been here for a long time as well, and I would that I'm not sure that they would know her as much as they would know Shazia, but yes, I think most of the artists, when you talk about some of these international artists, there's such a handful. When you talk about China and US, you're talking about these massive populations where institutionalization of art has happened for the last 200 years, right? So it's natural that there's so many artists. This is why it's so challenging. But in most parts of the world, it's really they're numbers. They're smaller communities. So getting connected to them and tapping in and maybe detangling their processes and histories is a little bit more simple.
Huh. Wow, that's so...
Maybe not. I wouldn't call it but possible to enter.
Yeah. Wow. Fabulous. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, this has been awesome. We need to wrap this up. Leeza, you are fascinating. You're doing important and good work, and it's involved in art. I mean, that's really, really exciting and wonderful for all of us. I applaud you. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. Let me unmute everybody so that they can say thank you to you. I appreciate
Thank you
so
so
much.
Thank you.
Can I say something?
Thank you.
I also want to say, I want to thank you all because, as I said, and I truly meant it, this is a change, and there is an energetic exchange that occurred between all of us tonight, and I was really, it's one of the most beautiful things that I think is part of the work that I do. So thank you so much for being interested and for pursuing what makes you tick, and joining this amazing program that you have created. Thank you so much as well. It's
wonderful.
Great. Have a wonderful night, and keep in touch. There you can get my contact in my website.
Awesome. I'm going to stop the recording. Leeza, thank you so much.